Welcome, Representative Johnson. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad I can finally get by.
Yeah, we've talked about it for a while. It's pleasing to have you here. So, we start with most of our guests by asking you to tell us a little bit about how you got involved with politics, how you got started. What's your path?
Yeah, I think my path to politics might not be the most conventional one because I can actually trace my involvement in politics back to a girl. In high school, when I was a senior in high school, I was dating a girl whose dad happened to be a state representative, and I was just looking for an excuse to spend more time with her. And I figured, she'd go by the office after school, and that's where she'd be, and I'd get to spend some time with her if I volunteered to work in his office. And so my high school had a community service requirement that you had to do anyway. So I set it up where that was my community service project, and I went and worked in the office and got to see my girlfriend, but then also discovered I had a real interest in politics, and that was sort of my first exposure to it. And interestingly enough, it was the exact same level of politics in the exact same office in the exact same district I ended up running for ultimately. But that's how I started, and kind of got the bug for community service and public service in general, and went off to college, went to Harvard, and then there I was really involved. I mean, pretty much my entire time there, I was really just a community service person. I ran a youth program in Cambridge, which in the housing projects that were near the university, and spent my summer there, working with those kids, and then came back, ran the community service arm of my fraternity, ran the community service programs for the Black Students Association, just more and more service type activities throughout college, and then came back to Dallas after I graduated and worked for a state representative, not the one I worked for in high school, but a different one, and sort of saw what that was like in Austin. I worked in her Capitol office, and then went to graduate school in public affairs, in law school, and came back and ultimately ran for the same state representative office that I started the whole process in back in high school. So that's kind of how I got into it.
When do you think you realized, how early in that track did you realize that you were going to run for elected office, do you think?
That's a great question. I don't know when I knew for a fact I would pull the trigger, but I think from the time I got the first exposure to the state representative that I worked for in high school, whose daughter I was dating, I kind of had the interest in. I thought, in the back of my mind, I might want to do this someday from an elected, standpoint. But I knew then that I wanted to be involved in somehow in public affairs. I knew I wanted to do community service type things. And for most of my early career, I didn't do elected politics really. I was a precinct chair, a Democratic precinct chair in Dallas, and that was pretty much my only political activity. I did a lot of nonprofit work. That was kind of where my passion was, and I did a lot of board service and worked with the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Dallas, which was an organization that I had been a part of as a child and participated in their after-school programs, and so I went on the board of the Boys and Girls Club. That was kind of my first big service opportunity, and so I just did a lot of board service and said, if it turns into elected service someday, great. And if it doesn't, I'll just be a very civically involved attorney. And so I'm not sure when I made the decision that I would run for office until I made the decision to run for office.
How was the transition? Obviously there was a gap there between what you saw as a staff person and what you saw as the person, in charge of the office.
Yeah, having both experiences is actually kind of cool. I brought a lot of my staff with me here today, so it'll be interesting to hear what they say after this about what I'm going to say now. But having done both, I think what I realized as a member that maybe a lot of other members don't realize because they weren't staff. Is that the people who are coming to work in the Capitol or coming to work in politics, they're not there for the money. Obviously, there is no money. They're there because they're either passionate about an issue or they're passionate about the process, and they really want to learn the process. And I don't think it's fair to ask people to work for such low wages, personally. And I think they're low, and I wish we paid our government employees more, but we don't. And I think it's only right that they be given the kind of experiences that they want. So I always ask the people whether they are interning for me and getting paid nothing or they're getting a salary and they're on the state payroll. I always ask them, what are you interested in? What do you want to learn? What do you want to see? What do you want to be exposed to? Because that's the way I want it to be treated as a staffer. And I can say I was treated pretty well as a staffer, but I think I'm a better boss and a better state rep as far as how I treat my staff because of the experience as being staff.
I would expect that it would help.
Yeah, I think it does.
So that said, you started as the boss in a very difficult time in terms of the state legislature.
Yes.
You're a sophomore this time. Your first session was, I think, a session that is already a little infamous and I think will go down in the lore as one of the tougher sessions of recent times. Talk a little bit about what it was like jumping in the pool in the 2011 session.
Well, for those of you who don't know, 2011 was the year we came in facing the largest budget deficit in the history of the state. We were looking at a $27 billion deficit. It was going to be a lot of, we knew it was going to be a lot of painful decisions that were going to have to be made surrounding the budget. And it was a large influx of freshmen who had been elected by the Tea Party, frankly. And so we knew we were going to have a tough sort of political battle going on within the Republican Party itself between sort of the more centrist ones and the more Tea Party-backed ones. And we knew that we were all going to sort of be held captive to that fight. And so coming in as a Democrat and a progressive Democrat at that, who had big ideas and big ambitions about what my public service is supposed to be about and who I'm supposed to be fighting for and what kind of causes I'm supposed to be championing, I think if I had never worked in the legislature before, I might have been extremely disappointed and extremely shocked at just how conservative the Texas House has become and just how hard it is to pass progressive policies. But having had the experience working here before and kind of being familiar with the process, I wasn't totally surprised by it, but it was still rough because the budget cuts that we made in the area of education in particular were just so enormous, and there was just so much of an outcry back home for me from the school district and the teachers and the administrators about what they were going to have to do without and what the impact on the kids was going to be. And then, of course, we cut everything else in the human services area, and that was all really hard. So it was just the tone and the difference in tone between last session and this session is almost indescribable. I mean, the fact that we are coming into this with at least on paper, a surplus, just has changed the entire feeling of this session. I feel like people are less sort of dour. It's just starting off the session that they are more optimistic, and you don't see as many bills being filed. I think people are just more. The feel is that things are more relaxed, I think, around the Capitol this time than they were last time. Less stressful.
I think a little bit more of a resumption of some degree of normalcy in a way.
Yes.
Okay, well, but you mentioned education, so let's talk about that then. So what do you see as the prospects then for education? On one hand, you talked about how different it is. On the other hand, I'm not sensing a rush to restore education spending among the majority. I mean, what's your sense of where that is? And obviously the court case counts.
Right. Well, I don't anticipate, particularly in advance of the courts telling us exactly what we have to do, I don't anticipate there will be any rush to first of all, overhaul the way we finance the system. I think the mechanism for financing our schools is going to stay in place until we're told it has to be done differently. If we're told it has to be done differently. I think we, ultimately, I'm hoping that we are told that we have to do some things differently, because I think we are kind of chronically underfunding education. But basically, I think that on education, the prospects of fully funding education, meaning going back to spending levels before last session, I think that's not likely. I don't think there's an appetite on the part of the party that's in a majority in both houses. There's not political will to go as far as restoring $5.4 billion in cuts and get us back to where we were before the 2011 session. I do think that the Speaker and Chairman Pitts, Chair of Appropriations on the House side, have said, and I think the ultimate bill will at least fund enrollment growth, and how much more above enrollment growth we get remains to be seen. So education is on everyone's radar screen this time, but from a funding standpoint, I'm not sure how much more above enrollment growth we're going to get. I think most of the discussion around education this time is going to be around, well, maybe at least on the Senate side, they're going to do some talk about vouchers. But on both sides, the accountability system and changes to accountability.
And what do you expect to come? I mean, as long as we're there, what do you expect to come in terms of this discussion of vouchers or school choice? Or the House has historically been the place where legislation like that has hit a wall.
Right.
What's your sense of the attempt to kind of reframe that and reformulate those kinds of proposals?
Well, I assume you brought me here to kind of give you the straight dope and tell you what I really think and not do too much dancing around, so I'll try to just answer that question directly. I don't think that there's the political will for it in the House. I think that there's, a few senators maybe who feel very passionately about this, and in the Senate, a few very passionate people can get something out of there. It's fewer players to have to account for. But in the House, we've got 150 people, all with, personalities and agendas and ideas, and I'm not hearing the appetite or the will to do vouchers in the House. Now, I could be totally surprised by that, but I think the vibe that I'm getting from our boss, the Speaker of the House, and what I'm hearing from the people on the floor is no one's really beating that drum on our side. And the way it works in our system, if no one's beating the drum on something, it probably doesn't happen because our system is designed, it's designed to be uphill. So if someone's not pushing something up the hill, it definitely doesn't happen. I don't feel like anyone's pushing vouchers uphill on the House side.
Yeah, the default is inaction, right?
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit about what you're working on specifically, and maybe we'll circle back to how that all fits into the broader picture.
Yeah, sure.
So what's interesting you this time? What are you looking forward to spending your time on this session? I know you filed some interesting legislation related to voting in elections. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah. Well, I'll share this with you about my philosophy on drafting legislation, or at least what amounts to the philosophy I have at this point. I'm still forming a philosophy. I'm just a sophomore, but I feel like you have to do some balancing between trying to advance the cause and push forward issues and advance a discussion on important progressive topics if you're on my side of the aisle. You have to balance that with a certain amount of practicality and what can you actually get done and what kind of things are important, what people call local bills, that kind of thing. What are you going to do for back home? And so I'd say I'll start with probably the most important of the back home things, the practical things. I think I'm going to be at the center of, and that's our water bill. I was fortunate to be named the vice chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. So, and the Natural Resources Committee is the committee that handles water policy in the state. And the speaker has said that water is his #1 priority for this session. Governors agreed that it's a top priority. I'm not sure if it's absolutely #1, but if it's not #1, it's #2 or #3 for him, which means it's going to get done. There's going to be some action on water. So I'm fortunate enough to be on the House committee that's dealing with the water issue in a leadership role there, and I'm the only member of the committee who's from my region, the Metroplex, Dallas-Fort Worth area. So there's a lot of responsibility that's going to fall to me to make sure that the water needs of North Texas and our region are a prominent part of the water plan that gets funded, the part of the plan that we put money into with the 2, 3, 1.5, whatever $1 billion it ends up being that we take out of the rainy day fund to put into a water plan. So that's really important. That's sort of a practical, do something for the folks back home type of thing that I anticipate being really closely involved in. I'm a joint author on the House bill that funds the water plan. Then there's the more progressive stuff that falls in that category of advancing a conversation that needs to be had. And that's where a lot of the voting rights legislation that I filed first this session, and I made a big deal of filing it first because I feel really strongly about the fact that we're going the wrong direction in Texas when it comes to our democracy. The beauty of democracy and what makes democracy so wonderful of a way to govern people is that it allows for people to participate and have their voice heard, and for us to sort of govern ourselves, to be mutually governing. But what I see happening in Texas is increasingly there's this gap that's forming between the people who are making the decisions in the state, who are setting the priorities and saying this is what Texans want, and what Texans want, because so many people have just opted out of the political system, in my opinion. They've said, it doesn't matter, or I don't see what the point is, or I can't be bothered. I'm too busy trying to make ends meet. And we need to be making voting and participating in the system easier. every chance we get, easier, not more difficult, because frankly, apathy and lack of participation is a much bigger threat to our democracy than voter fraud has ever been or ever will be. So I'll go on record and be very public about saying we don't have a voter fraud problem in Texas or anywhere in this country. We have a voter apathy problem in Texas and everywhere in this country. And we need to be encouraging people to participate, particularly young people, which I hope we talk about too, about what I'm trying to do to get young people more plugged into their politics. But we need to be making it easier to vote. So I introduced a bill that would make Election Day a state holiday. That would help state employees vote for sure, but it also sends a message to private sector employers that, give your employees a day off for Election Day, or at least give them enough time to go vote during working hours without docking their pay so people can participate. And I'm going to file a resolution to encourage Congress to do the same thing for our federal Election Day. So, presidential election every 4 years, you ought to get that day off to go participate. So stuff like that are small, sort of steps in that direction. But then there are the bigger, fundamental, systemic changes to the way we do elections that I would love to see happen someday, like same-day registration. There are states that allow you to show up at the poll, register at the poll, and vote at the poll all at the same time, the same day. That's encouraging people to vote, making it easier for people to vote. We should be looking at ways to vote online in this state at some point. I didn't file a bill on that, but that's the kind of thing that we need to be moving toward, not imposing barriers, artificial barriers to voting like voter ID, which I filed a bill to repeal the voter ID law that we passed last time because, again, it's attacking a non-existent problem of voter fraud that we don't have, and it's making it harder for portions of our population, primarily old folks, African Americans, poor folks, ex-offenders. It's making it harder for those people to participate, and I think that's the opposite direction we need to be going in.
Is your sense of this that this is sort of the opening, it's not even the opening salvo, but in terms of your individual or your specific participation, that this is the opening salvo, will probably be a long fight in terms of talking about, given the national conversation, given the momentum?
Yes. I don't think it will be a short-term victory, but I do anticipate during my lifetime, and certainly within the next 10 years or so, I expect to be at a press conference, at a bill signing with a Governor Castro or a Governor somebody who's more likely a Democrat and a progressive, and us signing the bill that will fix all these problems that we just described with voter ID and making it easier than ever to vote in the state of Texas by being able to vote online or vote same day that you registered, that type of thing. I anticipate we'll be signing those bills into law sooner rather than later, but certainly, it's going to be tough to get that done this session with the makeup of our state government right now.
Okay, so in a related front, it seems to me you have, as you mentioned, you've been involved in the organization of the new caucus focused on youth issues. Talk a little bit about that and how that came about and who you got involved and what you hope to accomplish.
Absolutely. Well, in the legislature, we have the ability to form legislative caucuses, which basically are interest-oriented, issue-oriented, groups of legislators who have some kind of shared interest or shared value system that want to unite to try to educate their colleagues on a particular topic. So, for years we've had a rural caucus to try to, for the rural members to kind of bond together to inform each other and then go out and inform us non-rural members about what the issues are facing rural Texas. The benefits of the caucuses are that you can raise money to help promote what the work of the caucus is to the other members by issuing floor reports and following legislation and things like that. But you also can do outreach into the greater community. I thought it would be great to form a caucus along the lines of a Young Texans orientation. And I'll tell you why. I was looking at my district numbers after the last redistricting, and I noticed that almost 60% of my district is under the age of 40, and that struck me as a really, really high number. So I looked into it more. I said, well, what percentage of the state and what percentage of the country, is under 40? And it turns out that we are a younger district and a younger state than the country overall. The country overall is about roughly 50% under 40 years old. Still a very high number, but Texas is hovering around 60% of its population being under the age of 40. And I realized that, that demographic, as big as it is probably one of the most disproportionately underrepresented demographics in the legislature, in state government, because I think there's this idea that people in that demographic don't really participate or can't really be counted on to participate consistently or reliably, so they get taken for granted or ignored, or even worse, sometimes I think they get exploited to a certain degree. So what we wanted to do, we being me and some folks I talked to in the legislature who were under 40 themselves, decided to do was form an organization that's for members of the House or the Senate if they want to join, but it's House members at this point who are under 40 themselves or who represent districts that are at least the state average of their population under 40. So that's about 58%. We decided to form this organization to track legislation and recommend legislation that would be of benefit to Texans who are under 40. But the most important thing, and I'm most excited about, is a big part of our mission is to do outreach to young Democrats, young Republican clubs, university Democrat clubs, university Republican clubs, young professional organizations. Every profession out there has got a sort of an under 40, group, young engineers, young real estate professionals, young lawyers, young accountants. We're going to reach out to all those groups, and we are going to be their voice within the legislature. We're going to be the one-stop shop for them to get information about what's going to impact their demographic, and for them to basically lobby and lobby and advocate for positions that they want to see us legislate. So the goal is to leave this session, go back out into our respective communities, all the members of the caucus, and ask our groups, first of all, report back to them what we did and how the session went, but then going into the next session, have a whole legislative agenda from these organizations that we can then advocate for to the broader House and Senate.
And looking at the roster of that caucus, you have a pretty bipartisan group, right?
It's almost an even split. I think it's 17 Democrats and 15 Republicans, or vice versa. We have 32 members. The vast majority of the members that are in the caucus are actually qualified based on age alone, but there's a few actually who don't qualify by age, but qualify by their districts being disproportionately young. But it's a great group, got a bunch of great committee assignments. They're members of the caucus in all of the key places you'd want them. So I think we're going to have a really, really great session. I think when we report out, how we did on the priority issues for us, which this session are water, transportation, infrastructure, education. I think when we report back on how we were able to do on some of those issues, we'll feel good about the direction the caucus is headed in.
So is your district also disproportionately?
Yes.
So
I qualify both ways.
So it's not like Logan's Run when you turn 40, you're going to have to leave
or
or something.
I should be able to stick around after, but we'll see. But I have a good vice chair, and Chris Patty, who's a Republican member from East Texas, that actually part of the state where my family's from. And that was one of the things we put in the rules. It was very important to me that this caucus not be partisan in nature and not get a partisan reputation. So I'm very happy about the fact that this shook out to be almost evenly split between the Republicans and Democrats. But I put in the bylaws, and the organization in their first meeting voted to approve bylaws that require a Democrat and Republican vice chair. They have to, whatever party the chair is, the vice chair has to be of the other party. So maybe next session, Chris Patty's the chair, and then another Democrat's got to step up to be vice chair. But that's the way I wanted it to be, and I thought that was important that we stay focused on the under 40 part of it and the issues part of it, and not let it devolve into a partisan thing, because I think that's hurting us a lot in state government right now. So,
do you think there's a little bit more of a will to try to turn that down? In some corners right now, the bipartisanship or the partisanship, yeah.
I think people who have institutional knowledge and memory of what it was like want that badly, and people who grew up in this environment, and I mean grew up politically in this environment, don't know the value of doing it any other way. Interestingly enough, I'm 37 years old, but I consider myself kind of an old schooler in my mentality, because I grew up politically as a staff person in the late 90s. I came in during the Pete Laney era. I came in during the George Bush era, when you had a Democratic lieutenant governor, a Democratic speaker giving the nominating speeches and lauding a Republican governor and helping him win the presidency in George Bush. I came through a house and a staff. As a staff, I came through a house where things were just different then. Like committee chairmanships. It wasn't that the small committee chairmanships were were available to the majority party, but not the big ones. You had people in both parties, if they had the expertise and they had the experience, you had them chairing committees that they deserved to chair, and it was just a less partisan environment. You didn't have to answer to sort of the hyper-partisan wings of your party. You kind of got to do what was right for the state, and I think we've gotten away from that a little bit, and I'd like to see it come back, and I think people who were around then or who remember those days want to see that come back too.
That mood really changed in the early 2000s.
Yes.
I mean, I think it's pretty,
Yes.
without blaming any individual people, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there was a sense in which the Republican majority had been out of power for so long that it might have been a little bit inevitable that some of that was going to go away.
By the way, I think that's an interesting point because it brings up a good chicken and or egg question. I never thought about this before. Did that change, that first Republican move in the House to, when they finally got the speakership, was that a sort of a precursor to something that was already afoot in terms of the hyper-partisanship, or did it help bring it along? Like, did that era help bring about this hyper-partisanship, or was it sort of just the first wave of what was already starting to happen statewide? I'm not sure. That's something for scholars like you to look into.
Well, I was actually going to ask you what
about.
You sort of formulated my question for me. I mean, it sounds to me like we don't know. I mean, what I would say is we don't know yet. But
you should write the book.
What I would ask you about that is, you're engaging in something with the caucus that seems to be trying to stem the tide a little bit or push that back in another direction.
Right.
Do you get the sense that it has to be this way or not?
I don't think it does, and I think that, like for instance, I mentioned my vice chair by name. I think he's the kind of person, and I think there are other people in the caucus and throughout the legislature. My desk mate, Lance Gooden, Chris Patty, these are people that I think represent the future of the Republican Party. And I think that Sarah Davis, some other people that I came in with, and some people I've met in this freshman class, it gives me hope that that they are more of the old school mentality, which is, we're down here to do a job, and that job is not just to represent our individual districts. It is that, true enough, but it's also to make Texas the best Texas it can be. And there's so much stuff out there that we could do that doesn't have to fall along partisan lines, that if we chose to, we could fill our tiny little 140-day plate worth of stuff to do with just stuff that Texans want us to work on. We choose to do the partisan stuff for political advantage in our primaries, and that's just the reality. If we wanted to, we could spend all of our time sorting out our transportation problems in this state, figuring out how we really fund the kind of transportation system that will allow Texas to be the world-class, top-level state that it could be, in terms of, we could have high-speed rail zooming along our interstates, taking people from El Paso to East Texas like that, and from all up and down I-30 on high-speed rail. We could have roads that you could, 6 lanes each direction, going up and down all the different thoroughfares of the state. We could have all that kind of stuff if we chose to focus on transportation, and that doesn't have to be partisan at all. I mean, that's just a common sense, practical kind of thing. Water policy, same kind of thing. Education, same kind of thing. Those, investing in higher education, investing in K through 12, that stuff doesn't need to be partisan, but that stuff doesn't win people hyper-partisan primaries in increasingly gerrymandered legislative districts. What wins you primaries is, let's talk about abortion, let's talk about sanctuary cities, let's talk about whether or not we want to make people have to show their papers, or we're going to deport them and that kind of stuff. We're going to turn our local police force into, an immigration enforcement agency. So, that's the type of stuff that gets people, I guess, elected in certain parts of the state in their primaries, but that's not the kind of stuff that the overall state wants us working on. And like I said, we could fill our entire plate with just the nonpartisan stuff, and we'd be a lot better off.
Well, it's hard not to be struck, I think, if you have been watching the legislative process and politics in the state for even a few cycles, about, at least at this stage in the session, the apparent consensus on just that position, certainly among the Republican leadership and increasingly among Democrats like yourself. That is that, talk of working on infrastructure, tackling problems, not being distracted. But within a few weeks, there's going to have to be hard decisions made,
That's right.
I mean, you talked about the priorities of the caucus being water, transportation, education. You didn't mention HHS, but you have filed bills about Medicaid, Medicaid expansion, compliance, Texas participation in the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
At the end of the day, there's going to be, it feels to me like we're set up for a little bit of a collision between transportation, water spending, which there seems to be an emerging bipartisan support for, and education and health and human services needs on the other side, which are much more contentious.
Right.
Is there enough money and is there enough political will to reapproach the finances and the fiscal situation of the state to fulfill the vision you just articulated?
Yeah, there's enough money to make small to moderate investments in everything we need to make a small to moderate investment in, if not slightly larger than small to moderate investment. Is there a political will? No, there isn't the political will to do it across the board. There's clearly political will for water and transportation, but whether or not there's political will for the health and human service stuff and some of the education stuff, clearly not. And I'll tell you, that breaks my heart, because something like Medicaid expansion, which I filed legislation to do, in an ideal world where we cared about the people of the state of Texas more so than we cared about being elected to some high office, maybe president, I don't know, something like that, where we cared really about what made the most sense for the most people and made the most fiscal sense and was going to help our local governments, our counties out, and take this burden off of them of having to deal with the uninsured through the emergency rooms in our state. In an ideal world like that, it would be a no-brainer, a hands-down no-brainer to expand Medicaid. It wouldn't be a partisan issue either. It's only partisan because a Democratic president that a lot of conservatives hate so much authored the legislation, or was the force behind the legislation that allowed for the Medicaid expansion. So it's a political statement to be opposed to it. Some Republican governors around the country have managed to rise above that and still do it anyway, because it just makes such good sense. 3 years, zero cost to your state. After that, a 10% to 90% state to federal ratio. I mean, I'll put it this way. There are some people in this room maybe who are business type folks. I'll put it in business terms. If someone came to you with a deal that said, we got a surefire investment that will, that if you can put up, 10% of the money, we'll put up 90% of the money to yield this excellent return. And that return in this case is ensuring 1.5 million more Texans, getting us off the list of the most uninsured people in the country list, making sure that our local governments aren't being bankrupted by having to support health care at the emergency room level. If you could do all of those things by putting up $1 for every 9, or $1 million for every 9 million, however you want to look at it, in a business sense, you'd be crazy not to take that kind of leverage. If someone will let you put up $1 your money for every 9 they'd put up, you'd say, sure, yeah, let's do that investment. It's the whole concept behind a leverage buyout. We're basically not doing that for political purposes, and it makes me sad. It makes me very sad, because we'd be a better state if we had fewer uninsured people, and we'd be a better, we'd be a more just state, that's for sure. It's probably the moral right thing to do, but it's the fiscally responsible thing to do too. So sure, in an ideal world, the governor would come out in the state of the state and said, we got this rainy day fund that's projected to have $12 billion in it by the end. We're going to undo some of the accounting tricks that we did last session. True enough, we're going to do the Medicaid IOU. We're going to undo the deferrals. But what's left, we're going to split up between all of our investment needs, both infrastructure and human. And so $1.5 million, $2 million to water, this much to education, this much to higher education, this much to Medicaid expansion. And thank you very much for making me your governor. I do care about you. I do love you. And I am more interested in your well-being than I am about becoming president.
Think there's a shot that people will, in the end, take the Medicaid money?
Who are people? I mean, I think there's a chance that if we did some straw polls and within both legislative bodies, that you might have something, approaching a legislative majority to approve an expansion, but our governor has drawn this line in the sand, saying he won't sign it. He's opposed to it. Again, a political decision. He would thwart the will of his own legislature, I think, if that's what it came down to. So there are people who have the attitude, and I understand it. It's a different political philosophy. We all have different ones. There are people who have the attitude of, why bother using political capital to send the governor a bill he won't sign? So there'll be people who just hearing him say in the State of the State, or hearing him say, when he's speaking to the Dallas Regional Chamber, that he won't sign a Medicaid expansion bill is enough to get them not to introduce it or try to pass it. I say advance the conversation, call him to the carpet. I filed a bill. I would encourage my colleagues to sign on the bill. I'd encourage them to vote it out of committee. I'd encourage them to vote for it on the House floor and send the governor something to veto. If he wants to run for president, which is fine, let the American people be the ultimate decider of how they felt about that decision when his opponents lay that out for him. When they say, in Texas, you had the opportunity to take your state from the most uninsured people in the country to, something less, less horrible. And you said, no, we're cool with being number 50. Let him answer for that politically.
You articulate your positions and your philosophy without resorting, I think, and for the most, to very partisan rhetoric. It seems to me like you're pretty careful about that, or at least, you try to be, I think.
Well, go ahead. I think there's a question in there.
Yeah, there is. So what I want to ask then is I want to ask you this without queuing it up in too partisan a way, but talk a little bit about where the Democrats are in the state and where you see the party going in the future, and what needs to be done to sort of build a more competitive Democratic Party that's statewide.
Well, I wish the chair of our party would ask me that. He's never asked me that, but I'll answer it because you've asked me, and I'd love to talk about it with anybody who actually cares and wants to do something about it. I think for too long, Democrats have embraced too much this idea that if we just do nothing but wait, we will become a majority party in the state due to demographic shifts. And we've abandoned what makes a working majority party in a state that doesn't have that type of a demographic advantage maybe coming its way, like candidate recruitment at the local level. We don't do a good job. I'll tell you what, I think I'm a pretty good Democrat. I think I'm a good progressive. I think I'm a good legislator. But I can tell you the Democratic Party wasn't ever going to find me. The state Democratic Party wasn't going to go into Dallas and try to figure out, who has a track record, who has the kind of profile, who's done the right kind of things to make a good representative of our party. The party's not interested in doing that, it seems. The party seems to be very content to just wait until the numbers become so overwhelming in terms of demographics. The idea being that someday the Latino plus the black plus the Asian plus the white working class vote will be such that you can't do anything but elect a Democrat statewide. While that may be true someday, I don't think that that's something that we should be waiting on, because I think you can bring about democratic control in the state a lot faster if you try to be the party that addresses the needs of most Texans, and you show that you have the capability of governing and being responsible, and that you're a responsible steward of taxpayer money, natural resources, and the kind of stuff that people really want to see their elected officials are getting involved in. So I think Democrats could get out in front on things like ethics reform, transparency, shining a light on state government and figuring out, how we're spending taxpayer money. Are we just giving taxpayer money away without any type of oversight and review to people who happen to have the best relationships in the governor's office? Or are we really spending it on ways that will benefit most Texans? Are we doing the right things with respect to infrastructure, like I mentioned before? These are the kind of things that if Democrats focus really hard on, and show that, we're the party that wants to give you that high-speed rail and wants to give you those highways so you can get back and forth to work without waiting in traffic forever, and that will attract more businesses to come here so that when these young folks graduate, they have a job. We're the party that wants to focus on water so that by 2060, we aren't, 8.5, million acre feet per year short of our water needs. We're the party that's going to do all that for you. We should be focusing on policy like that, and we should be focusing on candidate recruitment at the local level to try to find people who have the advanced degrees and the training and the demonstrate. It shouldn't be enough just to be a party hack who's been going to a lot of Democratic functions for a long, long time and now it's your turn. No, you need to show me that you got some kind of head for policy and that you, sure enough, share our progressive values, but you've got the right profile, that you haven't been convicted of any major crime or something like that, and that you got a good, clean record, and that you're the kind of person that we can run in East Texas, and that people won't automatically go, oh, it's a Democrat. We know what that's going to be about. It's a city Democrat. They're going to be corrupt, and they're going to be about wasting taxpayer money. They need to see people that they can look at and say, it's a city slicker maybe, but it's somebody who's talking about bringing, water to my area in West Texas, or transportation into my area in East Texas, So I think there's a different way to go about handling becoming a majority party that doesn't involve sitting around and waiting.
Well, it sounds like you think that it's going to take some organizational rebuilding to make that happen.
It's going to take people who believe that that's the way a party should be built. It should be built on its ideas and the strength and the talent of the people, not just looking at skin color and saying someday we're going to be able to play the matchy-matchy skin color game and we're going to win based on that. No, it should be, we run the best candidates. We always do. We run the cleanest candidates. We always do. We run the smartest candidates. We always do. We're the party where it doesn't matter if you're disabled, or it doesn't matter if you're a woman, or if it doesn't matter if you're young or old, or it doesn't matter if you're black, white, brown, whatever. If you have a passion for policy, not politics, and you want to govern like a steward, and you want to be the kind of person that that can engender enthusiasm on the part of people and get them, tuned into politics again, and not just assuming that we're all criminals on the take, but can restore confidence in people, then we want you to run as a Democrat. And we're going to go out into cities and towns around the state and try to find those people. It's a mayor here. It's a city council person there. It's a county commissioner there. It's someone who's working in a law firm there. It's someone who's teaching school there. There are all kinds of people who we could be out there right now talking to, saying, have you ever thought about running for your school board? Have you ever thought about running for city council? Have you ever thought about and getting them started on a life of public service? And I think that's the way you make the state turn blue faster. And it's more legitimate that way. To me, that's winning the right way. And that's what I'd like to see happen. But like I said, no one's ever asked me. So.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I want to take some questions.
Sure.
So I'm going to wait for the microphone to get queued up and open it up for questions. And that's everybody. That's back over here. If you want to ask something, ask. Yes, you can either stand or sit. Just introduce yourself so the representative knows who he's talking to.
Hi, my name is Sam Hagan. I'm an intern with one of the lobbyist groups, Focus Advocacy, here in town. I was just wondering, the budget proposals that have been put out by the Senate and the House. The Senate's budget is much more lean than the House budget. I think it's by an order of like $1 or $2 billion. What do you think that what's the main elements of difference between those, and how do you think those are going to be solved?
I'm not sure exactly what accounts for the difference, because I have not sat them down and compared them much. I was on appropriations last session, so this time last session I would have been knee deep in that bill and really looking at it. And I know from experience that, frankly, whatever differences there are going to be hashed out later on in conference committee, and there's a lot of activity that's going to happen between those two bills that were filed and when we ultimately pass one. So, I wouldn't get too worked up about what the differences are. But, if you look at our state budget, a huge percentage of that budget is accounted for by human services, education. So you have to assume that any significant difference in that budget is going to have to be in those areas. So maybe the Senate funds higher education at a lower level than the House. That's a good guess, for where that difference might be accounted for. Higher education, they might do something different on public ed, and they might do something different in any number of areas in health and human services. But pretty much that's your big area to cut from if you're looking to cut something in our budget, because that accounts for the lion's share of it. So that's what I anticipated would be, but I don't know exactly what accounts for the difference this time.
And in terms of thinking about the process, these are always opening bids.
Right. That's exactly right. The governor gets to write a budget too, and that usually is, well, it's something. I know it doesn't. It's not the budget that you ultimately end up with, but it expresses his priorities too. So you'll have a third one to compare between those two, to sort of go, well, where they differ. But ultimately, it'll be the Senate bill with modifications that ends up becoming the law.
I want to do a follow-up. It's a little bit in the weeds, but since you've been on appropriations, you have a view on whether the rainy day fund will be ruled as counting under the budget cap or not?
I don't. I mean, I need to ask someone sort of where Pitts is, on that. I've not actually gauged his feelings on it, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends who you ask. Somebody from LBB testified it does, but other people seem much less sure.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I'm not advised at all on what people are doing. I'll tell you what, appropriations is a heck of an experience. For a freshman, it was something else to be on that committee my first session. I mean, you kind of come right out of the gate. You get elected, you get your office, you learn where the restrooms are, you start learning people's names, and then they tell you, okay, here, help us write this $180 billion budget, which is an extraordinary opportunity. And I learned a lot, but I think you're either an appropriator or you're not, in terms of like in your heart, you're appropriator, you're not. And I figured out pretty fast that it helped me. It informed a lot of what I think about state government and where there are opportunities to affect policy through the pocketbook. But I was not chomping at the bit to get back on appropriations this session. So yeah,
useful to know how that part of the machine works, but you don't necessarily want to be that mechanic.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Josh?
Hi, so I'm going to follow up the follow-up. On these self-imposed restrictions, like the balanced budget and the spending cap, I sort of wonder, as a self-described progressive Democrat, you spoke a lot about building party organization and that sort of thing. And in the last session, sort of there were these cuts that were, forced because there's not going to be any tax increases or anything like that. And it's not as though people were voted out of office in droves, which to me kind of says that, people kind of expect that there's this sort of way that Texas does things with respect to their budget. But as a self-described progressive Democrat, how do you see the Democratic Party, if it does take power in the coming years, dealing with these self-imposed restrictions? I
mean, the interesting thing about that question is that, every rule, every law, everything that we abide by, both internally and that we pass for the whole state to live by, are creations of the legislature. They can be changed by the legislature. Constitutional limitations are not given to us from God. They came from the legislature. Some legislature, put that out there for the voters to vote on. The voters approved it, but you can undo it through the same process, and maybe that's what the Democrats would want to do, maybe not. I mean, if we took over, maybe we would want to change something about the spending caps and things like that. But I think the bottom line is that I do think that there's a little bit of concern that more people weren't sort of punished for the votes they took last session. But the reality is, and this is just sort of something I've come to accept about politics, is that taking the low road is very tempting to a lot of people because people do want to hear certain things naturally. They are inclined to want to believe that everyone involved in state government is corrupt. they're inclined to believe that we're just down here spending all the money. And that's all we want to do is spend more, and that we want to tax more. So even in the face of facts, like the fact that we're the 48th, maybe 49th, I don't know, per capita spender of all the states in the union, there's still this perception that there's all this fat there to trim, and that, you know, real conservatives would get down here and trim the fat. So everyone's running terrified on the Republican side of being primaried by someone who's going to say, you know what, even if you cut taxes every term you were down there, they'll say, I would have cut them bigger and faster. I would have done more. And if you think about what happened to Governor Dewhurst in his race against Ted Cruz, that's really what happened. David Dewhurst ain't nobody's liberal, ain't nobody's big spender, but he got spun that way by someone who just said, oh yeah, whatever he did, well, you know, tack one is to say he was a big spender, which is not true. Tack number two is, okay, he says he's not a big spender. He says he cut this, he cut that. I'll grant him that. I would have cut it twice as much, and I would have done it twice as fast. It would, you know, and how do you compete against that? Because the public's going to say, well, yeah, I'll go with the guy who would have done it more and done it faster. So that is something that's going to be a challenge to overcome. But I think at some point, the state's going to show the wear and tear from these policies, and that will be what helps turn the tide. I mean, the rhetoric is going to always be hard to overcome because people want to hear that you're going to lower their taxes and that you're going to spend less of their money. I mean, I know how to go run a great Republican campaign. I've never been a Republican day in my life, and I know how to go and tell people, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give you back more of your money, and I'm going to, you know, lower your taxes, and I'm going to return government to the people, and we're going to get out of your way. We're going to let you do what you do. I mean, who doesn't want? That's what everybody wants to hear in every aspect of their life. I'm going to get out of your way and let you do what you do and give you more money. I mean, that's really easy to say, and there are people who take that path politically. I think that works until the wear and tear starts to show, until you can't get to and from parts of the state conveniently that you used to be able to get to, until you turn on the tap and there's no water. Things like that. And until you send your kids to a public school and 12 years later, you know, you're talking to your child and you're like, you don't really know anything, do you? Like, you know, you don't know who like the president was 3 presidents ago. Like, well, you know, what did you learn in school? You know, like that's going to start happening. You're going to start realizing that the schools that you're paying for, whether you pay property taxes because you own a home or you're paying them indirectly because you rent, no matter what, you're paying property tax, you're paying for our public schools. At some point, you're gonna want a refund for the product. I mean, you're gonna be like, what do these kids know these days? What are you learning? You know, you can't do basic math. You can't make change. At that point, people are gonna say, okay, maybe we've gone too far on this underfunding education thing. Maybe the guy in the Republican primary who's saying, I'm a conservative, but Johnny needs to be able to do math. And he needs to be able to make change. He needs to be able to read. Maybe that guy will actually win a primary. And then that's when you'll start to see things change, I think. We got one here.
One last one.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Hope Osborne. I work in Representative Anchia's office.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes, he's
Good friend.
fantastic. My question is, you mentioned earlier, but I don't think we got to quite talk about it, is your ideas on how to get younger people, especially maybe my generation, out to the voting booths, and you know, your ideas on that.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what we didn't do anything when in the voter ID bill. We didn't do anything to help when in the voter ID bill we wouldn't allow a state-issued student ID to count as one of the acceptable forms of ID that you can vote with. I mean, I just think that boggles the mind that concealed handgun license, totally legit. University of Texas student ID, not legit. Makes no sense. So that didn't help make, you know, that wasn't saying the right message to young people that we want you to participate, we want you involved. What I'm hoping to do through the caucus is to gather basically information from the heads of a ton of different organizations that represent all different types of groups that cater to that demographic, that age demographic. I'm just defining demographic by under 40. So we're talking, you know, young political clubs, but also, you know, young, there's in most cities, there's a young chamber of commerce, there's young lawyers associations, there's young everything. We're going to do massive outreach to these organizations and say, we want you to know who your Young Texan caucus members are. We want you to know what the issues are that we think are facing young Texans, and we want your input on what we should be doing, how we should be voting, and things that we haven't thought of that we need to be introducing We want to hear your ideas about those so we can introduce them. And we want to go around the state and bring the show sort of on the road and go into your communities and let you have an opportunity to interface with the members of the caucus in your backyard. So the vision is session ends, and we're going to have a legislative wrap up in San Antonio. And the Young Texans Caucus members from San Antonio are going to be front and center, and we're going to explain to the young chamber in San Antonio and the young professionals groups and the student groups and the whoever is interested. We're going to get them together, and we're going to let them meet young Texans from around the state, hear from all of us about what we accomplished or what we didn't accomplish, what we hope to accomplish next time, and meet their local members. So then now they're plugged in, and now they can participate next session by coming down, and we're going to help organize lobby days, which are basically different issue-oriented groups or interest groups will come down one day and bring all their membership down to the Capitol, and they'll go meet with members all across the rotunda, the Senate and the House. They'll go and just advance their agenda by explaining with people what they believe in. We're going to help organize those for young people so that they come to the Capitol and they can meet members and they can get involved like that. So basically we're going to do a lot of work to reach out to these groups and let them know that we're a resource for them. So that's basically the plan. And we'd love to have you get involved. So what part of the state are you from, or where would you be getting involved? Here at the university? Yes. Would you? Okay, so yeah, so we're definitely doing outreach here at the university for sure. We've been contacted by some student groups here, so yeah.
Sign up. State Representative Eric Johnson, thanks so much, man.
Yes, thank you very much.